Good afternoon and welcome to the Soul Shop. I am your host, Phyllis King, and today we're going to touch on a pretty sensitive topic for a lot of us, but it has to do with the mistreatment of animals, animal testing, animals used in laboratories, breeding and research facilities that create animals just for this purpose, apparently. And then also, we're going to flip the switch a little bit and find out what we can do to help. We're going to talk about how we can actually affect legislation in Washington, D.C., and how we can also adopt and care for some of these wonderful, beautiful creatures that haven't gotten a good chance in life. Fortunately, today I'm speaking with Monica Engebretson, and she is the head of public affairs for Cruelty Free International's North America's chapter. Welcome, Monica. Thanks for being here today.
Right. Thank you for having me.
Well, you are in the trenches. You know, we all love animals and none of us want to think about anything terrible happening to them, but it's going on a lot, all the time. And I want to hear about all you're doing. But how did you get the stomach? How did you get the tenacity? How did you get the motivation to dive into this really challenging area and pick up the torch?
Right. So I've been an animal advocate probably my entire life. I think there's kind of two kinds of people that are involved in animal advocacy. Those that have just always loved animals and it was an extension of and then others people that had an aha moment at one point that changed them into awareness of animal issues and they became an advocate. I'm the first kind. I just grew up on a farm. I always loved animals. And so I was early on, campaigning. My first advocacy was campaigning to release the class pet, which was a native lizard in first grade. I lobbied my first grade teacher until we set that little lizard free. So it's kind of always been in my blood. And then in high school, I was always circulating the petitions about animal testing and went vegetarian in high school and just kind of went on to college. And my background was in wildlife science. But while I was there, I was running the student animal rights, Students for Ethical Treatment of Animals on the campus at Humboldt State. So it's just sort of an extension, something I was always called to do, I guess, if you can say you had a calling.
Well, I guess if you were raised on a farm as well, was your family of the same ilk, or were they also, and that you were just this way? I mean,
yeah, so more of a welfare. Obviously, we had hunters in our families, so a different kind of like appreciation for animals, like animal welfare, farmed animals. But I kind of, went the extra mile where I started thinking about, well, why do we treat them differently? Are some of the things that we do to animals necessary, and why would we harm them if it wasn't something that needed to happen? So somewhat, but also just exposure to animals, my whole life.
Amazing. What a great story. So how did you become part of Cruelty Free? Is it Cruelty Free International?
Yeah.
How did you become part of that?
So I had been working in wildlife conservation organization called Born Free and the Animal Protection Institute for many years. And in 2013, I made the switch over to Cruelty Free International, which was originally called the British Union for the Abolition of Vivisection, which is a over 100-year-old organization based in London. And they recently changed their name to reflect their international work. And part of the work they wanted to do was in the US. And I stepped up to lead their U.S. campaigns and have been working on the issues of animals and research and testing ever since.
Amazing. And just recently, you have been to Washington, D.C., and you have been active in trying to help get resources directed to the CARE Act. And could you talk to us a little bit about what that is?
Sure. The CARE Act is one of our priority bills that we're working on at the federal level, and stands for the Companion Animal Release from Experiments Act. And what this bill would do is it would require any facility, any laboratory that takes taxpayer money from the National Institutes of Health, which is most universities and laboratories, the NIH is the biggest funder of animal research. It would say that they need to have in place adoption policies for dogs, cats, and rabbits when no longer wanted for research. And they would have to post those policies online, so there's public transparency. What's the policy, the adoption policy for animals they no longer want? And they'd have to keep track of the animals that they were adopted and also publish how many animals were adopted. So there's some accountability.
Well, that seems like it would be great. Now, is it true from what I'm reading? I know this particular press I got from your people talks about beagles. What is specific about the in vivo beagles? What's going on with that?
Yeah, so beagles are the breed of dog that are most commonly used in research because they're small and they're just so easygoing, and they make a good test subject, if you can call them that. So beagles are the ones that are most commonly used. In Vigo, there was recently a case where in Vigo was a breeding facility that bred beagles for research purposes, and they were recently, because of violations of the Animal Welfare Act, forced to close down, and they ended up putting up like 4,000 of their beagles were released for adoption. So there was this influx of beagles from that particular case. And although adoptions of animals have been going on for a while, but I think most people may have heard of the Envigo situation because there was so many animals that were released. Many of them were puppies, some were pregnant females. And we actually did an event we can talk about later on Capitol Hill with many of the Envigo beagles who came to Capitol Hill for a beagle meet and greet with staff and congresspeople to encourage the support of the CARE Act.
How did that come into being, this CARE Act? Who initiated that? And was that part of you, or how did that come to be?
Yeah, well, there are, at this point, there are 15 states that have passed similar state-level legislation requiring usually dogs, sometimes cats, saying that if they take public money, you need to have a policy in place. So the states have led the way on this. We were up talking to legislators about various animal issues, and in fact, the legislator staff that we talked to, she had asked us if there was anything that they could do specific to rabbits. And when we already were working on other things like cosmetics that involve rabbits and things, and she was interested in adoption bills. And so we said, well, there isn't a federal adoption bill for extramural research, and there's no reason we can't include rabbits in the animals adopted. I have personal experience with adopting rabbits from laboratories, so we went ahead and put together a draft bill, and they introduced it.
It's just amazing. I love this story. But there is part of the story that we have to talk about that's not something we can love, but it's why you're doing this work. And, what goes on behind closed doors, it's out of sight, out of mind. You mentioned cosmetics, but what happens to these animals behind closed doors?
Yeah, so in the laboratories, animals such as dogs and cats and rabbits, which we're kind of focusing on those species, they might be used in various kinds of testing. There's chemical testing, which would involve usually injecting the animal with a ingredient to see how it affects their internal organs and at what point they die, or some of the more physical, the older tests such as skin irritation would be putting the chemical directly on the skin or dripping the chemicals in their eyes. Today, like with the beagles, those are primarily used in drug testing as second species in toxicity tests, and other types of experiments, basic research experiments often use rabbits, and they also be used in antibodies research. So it's not just the experiments themselves. Of course, those where they experience extreme pain and suffering, and sometimes pain relief is not provided because they see that it would, impact the results of the testing that they're doing. It's that the animals live in very sterile, barren environments up until the time that their research begins. So the suffering isn't just in the experiment itself; it's in the entire environment that's very devoid of, comfort, and the things that animals would like to do are limited in the laboratory environment.
So when you get an animal or they're released, if they haven't died, I'm assuming that many of these animals, they can't survive this experience, that many have to put down, or is that what happens?
Yeah, so sometimes an animal will be used in an experiment, and depending on the experiment, they survive the experiment and are healthy and otherwise able to leave, and the laboratory no longer has any use for them. A lot of times they'll be reused for some other experiment. In some cases, a laboratory might acquire or breed more animals than they realize that they need, and decide they no longer have use for the animals. And what typically happens is they just kill animals they no longer want anymore, even if they're surplus or even if they've never been used. So some of these animals maybe have never been used. They've just been, or they were breeding animals that were used for breeding to produce other animals. So there's lots of ways in which an animal might become surplus to the needs of the laboratory. And this is if the animals are healthy and don't have behavioral issues, then they can be adopted. And that's something that has kind of caught on in recent years, and rescue groups have been eager to get involved and help with this. So most of the laws that are passed in the various states, they do focus on dogs and cats. We're trying to get rabbits included as well, is they don't require a shelter to take these animals. So it's not like a rescue group or a shelter that's already struggling is suddenly going to get an influx of animals that now they can't accept. They have to be willing to accept the animals, but very often they are willing. So it becomes an option, a better ending for the animals, a second chance, if you will.
Well, let's talk more about that in just a second. But I'm just curious, and maybe you know, maybe you don't. But I mean, there's so many. I'm always seeing on the news people who are going to jail for abusing animals and doing harmful things to all kinds of animals. How is this area? Why is this separate from traditional laws? How are organizations able to do this when typical laws would have them criminally prosecuted?
Yeah. So as far as the experiments themselves aren't considered cruelty to animals because they're considered part of the experiment themselves. And if you're referring to how do people get the animals or the actual treatment of the animals in the laboratory?
Why are they allowed? Because that seems like to have them in these confined environments with no love and care, and then to just at many times harming them and leaving. How is that okay? How does that reconcile with an average Joe Blow on the street who's being mean to their cat and goes to jail for 6 months?
Yeah, I think the dichotomy is definitely there, where if the things that people do to animals in the laboratories and the ways that the animals are kept, in many states, depending on your state, somebody, just a member of the public, was doing those same things to an animal or holding them in those similar bearing conditions, they might be in violation of the law. The Animal Welfare Act provides just the most basic protections for animals in laboratories. So they would have to have, food, clean water, and a clean space. But it doesn't, for most species except primates, doesn't require any form of enrichment. Socialization isn't necessarily required, these sorts of things. So while their basic needs should be met, and so when a situation comes up where, like I mentioned earlier, in Vigo, having had violations of the Animal Welfare Act, things had to be really bad if they could not even be meeting the most minimal standards of what the Animal Welfare Act requires. Things are bad if you can't even meet the basic standards of care that are required of animals. But yeah, you're right. If individuals did or kept animals in conditions, they would probably be afoul of their state anti-cruelty laws.
Okay, and then before we get into the solutions and the adoption piece, because I'm just curious about, and I know everyone needs to make a living, and I certainly can understand human beings, we need to test medicines, and there's different ways we need to go about doing that, I suppose. But what kind of people work in these laboratories? Are they just so uber scientists that they're just there's something that they don't feel what's happening? Do you know any of these people? Have you witnessed how they can manage to tolerate that experience?
Yeah, it's a range of people. Some are just technicians who get a job in the laboratory and are carrying out the experiments and part of what they're doing. Some just really do probably believe that it's necessary. It's what they need to do. Although, like I said, many of the other bills that we're working on are working to bring in the new alternatives, that don't require animal testing, other ways to do advance human health without the use of animals, and technology is really leading the way there. So we're looking to a future where animals will no longer be in these situations, but as to why somebody would choose to do animal research or would continue to do it, I guess the situations vary. There is a very good book out by Dr. John Gluck, who is a former primate researcher, called Voracious Science and Vulnerable Animals. And he talks about his whole journey, and it gives you a little bit of an insight why somebody might get into the field and really think that it's necessary, but over time he started to realize that it wasn't and started to think about the abuses that were taking place, and he changed his position on it.
And we're only talking about the United States, but I'm assuming this is going on in many parts of the world.
Oh, yes. U.S. is probably one of the biggest users of animals in research, but yeah, animal research and testing takes place all over the world.
Wow. And I guess when I was reading the information that came from your office, just this idea of we all know how wonderful dogs are for the most part, and they're literally man's best friend. And it's to hear about that that's part of the reason they're used because they're so easy to get along with. And it's just really heartbreaking. It's hard for all of us. We like to turn away because it's just so unfathomable to know what's happening to these creatures. Almost like when you see those Korean meat shops or those cages with all the dogs in it. I'm going off on a tangent here, but let's get back on point and talk about what can be done to help these animals, and that we how can we adopt these animals, and should we, or are any of them, are they good for home use, or how does it work?
Yeah, so there's actually been studies that have followed animals that come out of laboratories, and they find, other than anecdotal evidence, that they do adjust to a home life. And those that adopt them usually say they would do it all over again. So the benefit doesn't just lie with the animal, it helps. The people benefit a lot, and they often really enjoy the concept that they're helping an animal, even if it requires a little bit of a transition. What they've found a lot with the dogs, except for puppies, when puppies come out, they're much more, malleable. But with dogs, they've found that it's very helpful if the home has another dog in the house, because they are very socialized with other dogs, and they have another dog that they can learn from, learning how to be part of a home, and working through some of the traumas that they might have. So that is something that's happened again.
How do you get your hands on one of these animals? How do you become a recipient or apply to adopt one? How do you find these animals?
Yeah, so that's all over the U.S., different states. There are rescue groups that will at times get involved with placing dogs that get released from laboratories. And sometimes you just don't know when a laboratory is going to decide sometimes to release animals. But like with the Envigo situation, it was right there in Virginia. Homeward Bound Trails, that have been taking dogs from them for years, were, of course, involved in helping place a lot of them, but it was such a big undertaking that it required many groups to get involved. So you would probably just hear about it through your local news, or following a group like Homeward Bound Trails, or there's Big Ol' Freedom Project, and those that for finding out when dogs are released. Locally here, I worked with a rabbit rescue group called Friends of Unwanted Rabbits that has multiple times taken rabbits that were released from a lab, put them into foster homes, and adopting them out into homes. And I have a rabbit from a lab in my office right now listening to this interview.
I love that. And so on the Cruelty Free International site, are there links to all these various ways we can adopt or be on a list to find out when animals are being released?
Yeah, we don't have that kind of a resource on our website, but we do have information about the CARE Act, because we're much more focused on the legislation.
Okay.
But through social media or Googling it, and oftentimes some of your local shelters will be involved in a big release of animals that are available for release, or any kind of rescue group that you follow, depending on your animal. Less cats get released, but there are cats that are sometimes released. But most frequently, I've seen dogs and rabbits, and sometimes guinea pigs are starting to be released from laboratories as well.
Okay. So it sounds like this is starting to become a little bit more, I don't want to say commonplace, but it's a newer trend. And the laboratories are they mostly on board with it, and they want to find these animals homes if they can?
Yeah, I think it depends with the laboratories, but the fact that they are willing to do it in some cases where they aren't legally required to, it means that there's something in them that they would, even if they believe the animals are necessary for whatever they're doing, that they also would like to have a different end, an opportunity for the animals to continue living. And sometimes it's, at a university, the students involved, or, that want to see, are pushing that there's another alternative for the animal to have a life outside, or they'll be adopted by sometimes people that work in the laboratories. But so that does happen. But I think it is becoming more accepted. And of course, as more states have started to pass laws, it helps push create momentum for a federal law. So that's what we really want, is a federal law. We think all states, especially in starting with ones that receive federal funding, if you're taking taxpayer money, that at the very least you should have a plan in place for, sending animals that you no longer need or want into homes.
So in terms of how the average person can influence the CARE Act, they need to call their representative. I know we have a link for folks to click on. Is it a donation? Is call the person, they call the representative and talk to them? What's the way to do it?
Yeah, so all they have to do is call their representative and say that they want their representative to become a co-sponsor of the Companion Animal Released from Experiments Act. And right now that bill number is 5726. It will have to be reintroduced next year, and it will have a different bill number, but it will still be called the CARE Act. And if they just want to remember the CARE Act, it has to do with laboratory animal adoptions, and it's we want them to sign on as a co-sponsor. The more co-sponsor a bill gets, the more momentum it gets to actually help us implement the law or get it connected, and it's a way to show support.
So we really want some good numbers coming forward for people to call their representatives and stay on it.
Yeah, and passing a bill, there's a lot of bills introduced every year in Congress, and very few make it through and can often take years, but that's not the only way that we're working on this issue. Every year they have to pass budget bills, and sometimes we're able to attach things onto appropriations bills to chip away at this issue without having to pass the bill in full. We can get portions of it passed through. So we're looking at ways to achieve this on many different levels.
And how does your organization get funding? Is it through donations or through grants, or how does it work that you guys can keep doing what you do?
Well, Cruelty Free International is headquartered in London, so is over 100-year-old organization. So most of our supporter base is in London, and I believe it is private donations. I'm not on that side of it, but yeah, we don't get any grants. I think it's all primarily private donations, just people that support our work.
So you have your little bunny running around your feet right now while we chat. What else would you like people to know or think about that we haven't covered today?
Yeah, so with this bill in particular, I know it's hard sometimes for people to get their head around the whole issue of animal testing and what they really think about it. And with the CARE Act, it doesn't matter what somebody thinks about animal experiments. All we have to do is agree that if the animals are no longer wanted, they should have a chance at a life. And so that's why I think it should be very easy for this bill to be bipartisan, for your legislators to support it, because you're not asking them to take a position on animal testing. Of course, we'd like people to take our position. All you have to do is agree that, yeah, of course, if the animal has a chance at life and there's a group that wants to help place them, yes, they should do that. And so that's what it makes it, I think, an easier bill for people to get involved in. And of course, you can step up and be a foster, not only in adopting animals, but you can foster an animal for an organization. They need time to go into a home and learn to be in a home. It would increase their chances of getting adopted. So you can foster an animal as well.
Mm-hmm. How many rabbits do you have in your home currently?
Currently, I have 1 rabbit, but there's 5 guinea pigs running around in here too. So
I love it. Well, I'm so grateful that you're out there with the torch leading this forge, and it's so necessary. And I hope everyone watching and everyone reading this in Eden Magazine will take it upon themselves to contact their representatives. Just appreciative for your work. And thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.